In this video, the Historic Ordnance series, we're going to go back to the Vietnam War to look at an improvised mine that was employed by the Viet Cong. The VC Skyhorse Improvised Anti-Personnel Mine. Now, I came across this one when I was researching for the video on the different types of booby traps that the Viet Cong would use in landing zones to try to cause casualties on the Allied force as they're coming in on the landing zone. This was one of them that was mentioned, but I didn't find a hell of a lot of information on it at the time. But at that time, I could find the pictures in the museums on these because a few of them have been captured and are on display. But when I finally get around to actually researching this piece of ordnance, I cannot pull up those pictures for the life of me. Didn't matter what I put in for the search terms. I couldn't even find the specific manual that gave me the more detailed information on this. A manual from the Marine Corps during the Vietnam War. Couldn't even find that one. So I've had to piece it together with information from a few from the U.S. Army, primarily from TC 5-31, Viet Cong booby traps, mines, and mine warfare techniques from 1969. The earliest I can find reference to the Skyhorse mine, though, is a MACV publication from 1967. Now, some of the technicals according to these two manuals. These mines were typically 2 inches in diameter and between 1 foot to 3 feet in length. The construction of it was a steel or an iron pipe. Legs on it typically were welded on, but was not unusual. It looked like in some of the drawings for the legs to be essentially tied on with wire. The two bipod legs in front are just to keep it stable in position. Some of them had a couple improvised legs and back. Most of them in the drawings, there was nothing. The back end would just sit on a rock or sit on the ground. Wherever was needed to, or whatever was needed to get the correct height to cover the kill zone for this mine. Inside the pipe itself, one end of it was closed off with steel, so that was welded in. In front of that was an explosive charge. Didn't say what type was most common, but I'm guessing it's probably going to be TNT or probably black powder. In front of that was the shrapnel for the rest of the pipe. And according to the manuals, it said the most common types of shrapnel were rocks, glass, little bits of metal, which they mean shrapnel from artillery, mortars, and bombs that were dropped on them that they picked up off the battlefield afterwards. It also mentioned in there cut sections of barbed wire. So that was packed in there, not too tight because you didn't want to turn this into just a big pipe bomb right next to your force. You wanted this charge to go off and expel the shrapnel out of the tube. So you had this kind of loose in here, but you had in there as much as you could get. And then in front of that, they had a wax seal to try to waterproof this a little bit. But I do remember notes in there from the manual that gave this most of the information on this. There was notes in there that these mines were prone to problems with moisture, primarily back here on the initiating system. Now on the back here, the initiating system, it was just a small little square box. That inside that was a primer, and in front of that was a powder charge, which probably a blasting cap was connected into it, especially if it's TNT in front of it, in order to set off the charge. And then to set off this primer here, which set off your initiation system, you had a striker arm with a firing pin or striker on it. This striker was forced upwards by a spring. Down at the bottom here was a pin that held it onto the box. That was the pivot point, and it was kept from flying forward with a retaining pin. That's what kept it from being set off when it wasn't needed to be. Now these mines were set off reportedly two different ways. Set off with tripwires and also set off with command detonation. And in command detonation, what they did, the Viet Cong set them up the same way they would for tripwire, but instead of attaching a tripwire to that retaining pin, they would attach something for a lanyard, a piece of string, rope, wire, whatever they had available. And when the Allied patrol was inside the kill zone, they'd yank on that lanyard, pulling the tripwire out, or that retaining pin out. Striker arm would go forward, set off the primer, initiate the charge, and he had this supersized shotgun shell going off, spraying the kill zone with shrapnel. Now the primary areas that these were laid down on were roads, trails, and any avenue that channelized, bottlenecked the Allied patrol into. These would be aimed right towards them. Now down here I have a setup on generally how this was probably set up. It wasn't drawn out in the manual. But what I could see for a roadway on this, probably this was employed most effectively on a curve, because this way you could put it on the curve, face it down inward to hit the target. Target would be light-skinned vehicles or troops that are dismounted, checking that road or checking that trail. So I have here a clearance team, so you'd have a minesweepers up here in front and then there's security behind them. You'd probably have a person hidden in the brush up over here watching down the road. He knows generally what the maximum effective range of the mine is. When that clearance team would get to that point where they're well inside the kill zone, he'd yank on that lanyard, setting off the mine, and then he would get the hell out of Dodge. Now if this was a trail and it's set up on a bend of the trail, you would probably have the tripwire coming out to a tree or a stake down here. So that would be a pivot point, then come down to another pivot point here, and the tripwire would come across the trail. And then when that point man would hit the tripwire, he'd snag it, pulling out the retaining pin, setting off the mine. Remember, the Viet Cong used a lot of vines when they did tripwires on a lot of their victim-initiated ordnance. So it wouldn't have been that hard for them to find a vine, string it across here, make sure it would move on those two pivot points, no problem, and then tie it off to that retaining pin. This thing, it's not too much different than what we see in some U.S. manuals, such as grenade launcher mines or grape shot charge. They basically just thickened up the body, and instead of stacking hand grenades inside it, like in the Special Forces manuals, they turned that thick pipe into a gigantic shotgun shell. Pretty simple, pretty ingenious. I do not have any information on the casualties inflicted by this mine. I could not dig up that stuff as to how effective they were. Only that they were employed on roadways, and as I said, I came across them when I was trying to find information on the types of booby traps and mines they used in helicopter landing zones. This was referenced there. So my guess is there probably was an improvised system for removing that retaining pin if it's covering a landing zone. Probably similar to that spinner that you had a couple pieces of metal or something on it that looked like fan blades and stuff from your desk fan that would spin, and the wind from the helicopter pulling the tension out of a tripwire going down to the piece of ordnance. Probably something like that would be tied to this for when it was put across landing zones. And I could see it being put in as a series, multiple of them going across, say, one length of the landing zone, that would get set off at about the same time, depending on how much wind is coming in, how many helicopters and stuff. Interesting, pretty simple piece of ordnance. I wish I could have found the pictures for you guys to get a better look at them. If you do look up the Skyhorse, you will also find reference to Viet Cong Skyhorse mortars. That's a different thing than this mine. That is just a version of a improvised mortar tube, which GIs gave the same name as this mine. I do not know if the Skyhorse is the VC name for it, or it's the ARVN name for it, or I doubt it was given to them by the US troops, but who knows. There you go, another piece of improvised ordnance from the Vietnam era. Now, for all my engineer brothers in the Patriot and militia movements, always remember, essay ons.